going to have some other moderators jump in, so it doesn't have to try and play two roles at once. Thank you for joining us for DNA Day, hosted by the Family Search Library in partnership with Roots Tech. My name is Beth, and I'm going to moderate today's presentation. So just a reminder, we're doing 7 classes today to celebrate National DNA Day. We're really glad you could join us. Before we get started, we just have a couple of housekeeping items. First off, these classes are being live streamed on several platforms, including the Family Search Library's Facebook page and rootstech.org. This means that the recordings for the classes will be available on Roots Tech in this next few days. Just so you know, we have a wiki page for today's class content that includes the handouts for all of the individual classes. And I'm just going to go ahead and post that in the chat so that you can take a look at the handout for Tanner's presentation. Note that our presenters are answering questions at the end of each presentation and as time allows. So just go ahead and put your questions in the chat or the comment section as we go through the presentation. And as a reminder, if you need help with a specific DNA research problem, we encourage you to sign up to meet one-on-one with one of our research specialists in a free 40-minute virtual consultation. So if you want to sign up for a virtual consultation, go to the Family Search Library's website at familysearch.org/library and click Research Help. And I'll also put that link right into the chat if you're interested. And just note that most of our presenters today also do these virtual consultations. You can meet with one of us. So let me go ahead and introduce our presenter for this class, Tanner Tolman. Tanner is accredited through the International Commission for the Accreditation of Professional Genealogists, also known as ICAT-Gen, for research in the Denmark region. He has a deep passion for both Scandinavian and DNA research and works full-time as a research specialist at the Family Search Library in Salt Lake City, Utah. Tanner also serves as the second vice president of the Utah Genealogical Association and as a co-administrator on the Yeoman's, I'm hoping I'm saying that name right, the Yeoman's Y-DNA Surname Project. He enjoys family history, Palpatine, bacon burgers, and Benissoir, which I don't know what that means, so you'll have to explain that to us, Tanner. But most of all, he enjoys playing with his wife and 3 small children. So I'm going to turn the time over to Tanner.
Thanks, Beth. So today's class is Genome Reconstruction. This is one of my favorite topics in genealogy. So the objectives for this class today is to introduce you to the best available tools for synthesizing a DNA kit for a deceased parent or grandparent. And specifically, we're going to talk about the Lazarus tool that's available at GEDmatch, Happy DNA, and Borland Genetics. And I want you to understand the importance of getting DNA from the oldest living generation before they die. So real quick, just before I get into what it is, genome reconstruction is not anything weird or creepy. It's not used for cloning. It's not used for resurrecting, and it doesn't have anything to do with physical DNA molecules at all. Instead, what we are doing is we are creating a raw data file for a deceased ancestor to resemble what a company would have made for them if they had tested in life. So this is an image of my own raw data file. And we don't need to get too much into what this all means, but basically, the companies record the results of your genes in a Word file like this. And it's by comparing this to every other file in the database that they determine who your relatives are. And the main thing I want to emphasize that this is actually a text file, which means it can be edited and typed over. And theoretically, if you knew how, you could create one for any person who's ever lived on Earth. So the goal with genome reconstruction is to infer what one of these must have looked like for a deceased ancestor by examining the DNA of enough of their living relatives. There's a lot of benefits to genome reconstruction. First of all, your deceased parent or grandparent will share more DNA with their matches than you do, which means that you will not have to sort out as many irrelevant matches. So this is an example here. So my great-grandfather is Oz, and then my grandfather is Farrell, and then my dad, me, and then one of my kids. And I'm showing how much DNA they all share in GEDmatch with Oz's top 3 matches that I didn't already put in the database for him. And so 500 plus 7 centimorgans, that's a really strong match. You've got a really good chance of figuring out who the common ancestor is. But then with each subsequent generation, it's diluting down until eventually, in this case, after 5 generations has passed, there's no longer any shared DNA. And so if this match was critical to my research in solving a brick wall, if all we had was one of my kids' DNA to work with, we would never see this match or know about them. I like to say that every time an old person dies, a library burns, and that is especially true if they never took a DNA test. So think about a time when you've been doing research and you've been frustrated by a lack of records, such as 1890 US research or Ireland, or just colonial US stuff. How much harder it was to do because the records didn't exist. And so that's why I kind of feel a sense of urgency about DNA. When we take a DNA test, we are creating a genealogical record that our posterity can use for future generations. Now, as you do genome reconstruction, you are going to develop a deeper love for your ancestors. It takes time and effort to make a DNA kit for them. And as you do that and go through that process, you'll develop a greater appreciation for them and learn to love them. Um, you will also develop relationships with your extended family. The great thing about genome reconstruction is that it's collaborative. You are going to need to convince your relatives to either take DNA tests for you or to send you the results of a DNA test that they've already taken. And either way, they're going to need to know you, like you, and trust you. And so, as you get to know all of your family members, you're going to become the glue that will help hold your family together for future generations. I also strongly believe that DNA can help other people. You might have a missing family member that you do not know about. And the testing and the work that you do in genome reconstruction can help them discover their way back to you. Adoptees, when they try and figure out who their genetic family is, will often take a DNA test. They rely on having close DNA matches that are already tested in the database and that are willing to talk and share their trees and things like that. But often, on the other side, once the family is found, it turns out that they had no idea that someone was looking for them. So you might have something like that. A lot of people tell me that they know all their cousins, but in reality, you don't know what you don't know. Um, and so I like to think of DNA as a genetic beacon that helps missing parts of our families discover their way back to us. So, with that, it's important to be able to share the reconstructions that we make. So, how do we do that? Unfortunately, reconstructions can't go into the largest databases. Ancestry and 23andMe don't accept uploads at all. And MyHeritage has banned reconstructions in their terms and conditions since June. Family tree DNA and living DNA, they haven't banned them, but really only a high quality kit has a chance of being accepted. Otherwise, their security measures designed to keep malicious kits out will probably kick it out. So the two main places to put a reconstruction are GEDmatch and Borland Genetics. GEDmatch accepts reconstructions, and it's really easy to make them work in the site. I have found that if you can get a kit above 50% complete, it will usually work in GEDmatch if you add white noise. And white noise is false DNA designed to not match any person who has ever lived. That just fills in some of the gaps. I've also found in GEDmatch that if you can get the kit above 75% complete, it will usually work in GEDmatch even without white noise. And then Borland Genetics, this was founded by Kevin Borland in 2018, and it was intended to become a database especially for deceased and reconstructed individuals. It offers dozens of tools specifically designed for genome reconstruction, and reconstructions of any quality are going to be accepted and given a match list, since that's the entire purpose of the website. So, how do you create a reconstruction? I first want to talk about Lazarus, just because anytime I do talk about the other tools, if people have heard anything about reconstruction at all, they will often just say to me, well, how does it compare to Lazarus? So the Lazarus is a tier one tool at GEDmatch, which means it's subscription based. It allows you to create reconstructions by comparing against your other relatives in the GEDmatch database. If you can reconstruct at least 20% of a person's DNA, it's going to batch process. And what I mean by that is GEDmatch is going to then compare that kit to everybody else in the database and try and create a list of relatives. And unless it has a ton of false positives, it will usually work and be ready for you the next day. Lazarus has a really simple workflow. There's group 0, 1, and 2. 0 is optional. This is where you're going to put the spouse and relatives of the spouse of whoever you're trying to reconstruct. Group 1 is where you're going to put the descendants of the target person. And group 2 is where you're going to put all other relatives. And it has a really simple logic formula. Any DNA that is shared by the descendants of a person and the other relatives of a person, the descendants must have inherited from the target ancestor. So that DNA is added to the kit. Unless that DNA is also shared by somebody in the spouses group, and then it's deleted just because it might be endogamous. Usually, not very much DNA is deleted. So, the advantage to the Lazarus tool is that you have a large pool of relatives to work with. Anybody who is appearing on your match list in the database, you can just use. So, this is how the tool works. So, you're going to put in the name of the individual, and then you need to specify the sex, and you can mess with the other settings or leave them alone. But then you go down and you put in the kits that go in group 0, 1, and 2, and then at the bottom you hit generate. And then it's going to run a bunch of fancy equations and then create the Lazarus kit for you. And if the kit is at least 1,500 centimorgans, it should be ready the next day. Now, the big problem that I have with Lazarus is that it has to be a research kit, which means that no one but you will ever be able to see the reconstruction. And you can't download the data to put it in another site. So, really, when you make reconstructions here, no one else ever sees them, benefits, or uses them. People like to say if a tree falls down in the woods, but no one is there to hear it, did it still make a sound? And I would say, if you reconstructed your ancestors' DNA, but no one but you can ever knows about it, sees it, or can use it, did you really help anyone? So, Happy DNA, this is the one I want to talk about next, and I really like this tool. Happydna.org is a free website that has a lot of tools for genetic analysis, and one of them is called Reconstruct Raw Data for One Parent. This tool allows you to reconstruct the DNA of a deceased parent using DNA from the living parent and 3 or more of their children. It's extremely user-friendly, but all the tests need to be from the same company in order for the tool to work. Now, the more children you use, the more complete and accurate the reconstruction is going to be. This website does not store raw data, and it doesn't create a match list like some of the other companies. It just gives you the raw data of your ancestor. So please take that raw data file and upload it into GEDmatch and Borland Genetics. So a really good example of using the Happy tool would be my grandfather. My grandfather, Farrell Tolman, passed away in 1970. Now, his spouse and all 9 of his children are still living. So he is a really good candidate for using this tool. So I'm actually going to just go live and show you how the tool works because it's really fast and that's actually the easiest way to do it. So I've prepared the raw data files on my computer. And so you just go to happydna.org and you click on tools and you click on reconstruct raw data for one parent. And then you're going to go to where you've got the files. And the first kit you put in always needs to be the living parent. Then you put in the DNA for all the other kids. In this case, 5 of the children have all tested with Ancestry. All the companies are equally good, but I'm going to use Ancestry because that's where the majority of them have tested. So now the parent and all 5 children are uploaded, and I'm just going to go ahead and click Run Happy. And already it's done that fast. So then you click Print Reconstructed Parent. You can rename it. Just make sure you keep .txt at the end so it doesn't forget it's a text file. But this right here is the raw data file. And because I used 5 children, it's probably about 96% complete. It would be better if I were to invest in testing the remaining 4 children. But even still, this is a pretty good reconstruction. So Happy is a really cool website when you have the right relatives. I'm just going to open up my PowerPoint again real quick. One second. Just a second. Okay. So because I've invested in reconstructing Farrell's DNA, all of his posterity can see what portions of their DNA they inherited from him simply by testing and uploading to the same databases. And they can see his legacy that lives on in them, and they can also use his DNA for their own genealogy. Next, I'm going to talk about Borland genetics. So, the whole purpose of the site is genome reconstruction. You can reconstruct up to 97% of a man's DNA or 100% of a woman's. As long as you have at least one descendant of the target person, you can always reconstruct something. So people always try and list what relatives they have, and they want me to map it out in my head, and they ask me if they can reconstruct something. If you have at least one descendant, the answer is always yes. Besides descendants, you can also use other genetic relatives of the target person and sometimes also spouses of the target person to help with your reconstruction. The main tools are missing parent, reverse phase, Phoenix, dark side, phase map locker, and Humpty Dumpty. So the missing parent is useful when one parent has tested and the other has died. It compares your DNA against your tested parent, and all the DNA that is unique to you must have come from the deceased parent. Now, if that sounds familiar, that is basically the same logic that Happy is using. The reverse phase, this one is probably one of my favorite tools on the site. You use this to reconstruct the DNA of the next generation when both of your parents are deceased, but you have your own DNA and one of your own children to work with. Basically, what you do is you do chromosome mapping on your child's DNA, and that allows you to separate out the DNA of your own DNA into the paternal and maternal portions. So this right here, this is just kind of an example of how it works because it's really not intuitive. Um, on the left, we have my grandmother's DNA, and on the right, we have my father's DNA. Now, my grandmother is the daughter of Joe Merritt and Lara Barris. So my grandmother has a full set of chromosomes from each one, but my dad has a random mixture of their DNA. So what it does is it compares grandma and dad, and it says in all the places that grandma and dad match, the chromosome map says in these pink areas, assign that DNA to Lyra, and in these purple areas, assign that DNA to Joe. But then it also does the opposite. So chromosome 8 is a really straightforward example because in this case, it was passed down intact. So what it's going to do is it's going to say all the DNA that grandma and dad match on chromosome 8, that is Lyra's DNA. And all the DNA that is unique to grandma on chromosome 8, that is Joe's DNA. And so both sides of grandma's DNA end up in the kit that way. There's two versions of this tool. There's the free version versus the automated version. The free version requires you to know how to make chromosome maps like that on DNA Painter. But if that's something that's complicated and overwhelming, the automated version may be useful to you. So here's just an example of the automated version kind of running its magic. In this case, Shirley and Sherry both tested before they passed away, and reverse phase is comparing the two of them to separate Shirley's DNA into her paternal chromosomes and her maternal chromosomes. So this tool is awesome. The Phoenix compares your DNA to any relative who is only related to one of your parents. Any DNA that matches between you and that relative must have come from the related parent. So that is the same logic that the Lazarus tool is using. Here's a list of potential relatives that you could use the Phoenix on. What they all have in common is that they're only related to you on one side. The dark side does the opposite of the Phoenix. The dark side looks at all the DNA that matches you and that relative, but in all those same spots, it picks the DNA that is unique to you. So really, the dark side is probably my second favorite tool on the site. Basically, you can use it to do kind of some cool things. Like, say you want to run missing parent, but you can't because both of your parents have passed away. You could compare your DNA to your father's brother, and it'll create a DNA kit for your mother. Or you could compare your DNA kit to a maternal half sibling, and it's going to give you a kit for your father. So all of those previous tools, basically what you're going to do is you're going to use those on living people, and basically they just break up your DNA. The point of all of them is to separate your maternal and your paternal DNA from each other. Once you've done that, the phase map locker tells the program which portions you're interested in. So you can create chromosome maps on DNA Painter and you link them to kits. And then you extract out the parts that belong to the ancestor you're interested in. Then the last step for any reconstruction is the Humpty Dumpty merge. And this is where you take all the good parts and you merge them together. So there's three options. First of all, you've got the option 1. And you only use this when all the DNA comes from one parent or child of the target. Option 2, this is always going to be the last step in your reconstruction. And option 3, you're only going to use this on living people. It's for if you have somebody who's tested with multiple companies, you just want to merge those kits into one raw data file that has all the genes tested at either one. Okay, so I'm just a case study using Borland genetics. These are my great grandparents, Joe and Lyra. Now, they both passed away a long time ago. DNA testing was not a thing when Joe died. It was in its infancy when Lyra died, and I did not test her. Hopefully, I can be given a pass, seeing as I was 11. But my grandmother and several of her siblings are all still living. So I did reverse phase on my grandmother and my dad. The result was 2 kits, one that was a 50% reconstruction of Joe's DNA, and the other that was a 50% reconstruction of Lyra's DNA. Specifically, it was the halves that they each passed down to grandma. So then I ran the reverse phase on 3 more of my grandmother's siblings. I got them tests and I got a child of each one, specifically so I could do a reverse phase. And so now I have 4 little kits for Joe and 4 kits for Lyra. Now, there was a 5th sibling, Mary Jo, and she died at a time that I was DNA testing. But before I knew it was necessary to test everyone in the oldest living generation. I did manage to recover half of her DNA by recruiting one of her children and a child of them to test. So that would be test takers 9 and 10 down here. So each of the kits made by reverse phasing grandma and her siblings, these ones, those all had half of Joe and Lyra's DNA each. The kit for Mary Jo was a mixture. Specifically, it was test taker 9's maternal DNA. Now, in each of the kits, all of the Lyra DNA is either her paternal DNA, which means it comes from Orlando Barris, or it's her maternal DNA, which means it comes from Mary Clark. So I created chromosome maps on DNA Painter showing exactly where the Orlando segments and the Mary segments were in all of those little broken kits. Now, I use DNA Painter a lot and I really enjoy chromosome mapping. But if that's complicated for you, the automated visual phasing tool can make the chromosome maps for you. So either way, no matter how you make the maps, the next thing to do is you're going to use the phase map locker to link those chromosome maps to the kits. So I used those maps to extract out the Orlando DNA. in each kit. And so I had all these little kits that just had Orlando's DNA. And now that I had all of those, it was time to merge them together. So I used Humpty Dumpty. Now, in this case, you're going to use option 1. And the reason is option 1 is when all the DNA comes from one child. And yes, all this DNA does come from several of Lyra's kids. But look at it this way. This is all Orlando's DNA that comes from just one of his children, his daughter Lyra. So you use that option. And basically, what it does is it merges it all together and it made Lyra's paternal DNA. Next, I use those same maps to extract out all of the Mary segments. So now there was a bunch of smaller kits just for Mary. And I merged all of those together to get a kit that had her maternal DNA. So again, you're going to use option 1 because this is all the Mary DNA that came from her daughter, Lyra. And then finally, what I did is I took that DNA and I stereo merged it together to get a larger kit that had 99% of Lyra's DNA. So in this case, you're going to use the stereo merge. You're always going to use that last. And this is the final product. Okay, and then I just did the exact same thing on the Joe kits. So in his DNA, some of the DNA is really from his father, George, and some of it is from his mother, Martha. So I created chromosome maps on DNA Painter, and I linked those using the phase map locker, and then you extract out all of the George segments from each of those kits, and then merge them together. And then what I did is I merged all of those George kits into one larger kit that had all of Joe's paternal DNA. Oops. So again, you're going to use option 1 because all of that DNA comes from his son, Joe. And then you do the same thing with the Martha kits. You extract out all of the Martha segments using the phase map locker maps. You use option 1, and then you merge those together. And I ended up with a kit that had 96% of Joe's DNA using the stereo merge. And so this here is the final product with that one. So some things that I learned by doing these reconstructions is my grandmother's DNA ended up being really important. I used it to reconstruct the DNA of her spouse and both of her parents. I actually ended up using the DNA of, this slide's a little out of date. I actually ended up using 15 test takers to reconstruct the DNA of 3 people. So it's actually better to invest in testing people while they are alive rather than trying to reconstruct their DNA after they've died. It's a lot cheaper and it's a lot easier. Also, had I tested Mary Jo in life, I actually would have completed the Joe Merritt kit. All of the chromosome mapping that I'm doing indicates that I'm missing a big chunk of Joe Merritt's DNA on chromosome 16 on his Michelson side, and that Mary Jo actually had that segment. So if I had tested her, I actually probably could have completed that kit. But also, had she passed away, the opportunity to do these reconstructions at all would have been lost entirely. As more and more test takers died, the fragments of Joe and Lyra's DNA would have become smaller and smaller in each subsequent generation. Eventually, Humpty Dumpty's broken into too many pieces to try and put him back together again. Now, even without doing reconstruction, this was still valuable. Each child that I tested had portions of their DNA that were unique to them. which means that there can be key relatives for your brick wall that only match one of the children. And I can't put Farrell, Joe, or Lyra's DNA into the biggest databases directly, but their DNA is there. I have put Farrell's DNA in Ancestry DNA. The way I've done it is I've tested his children. And so his DNA is in that company, just split out among the kids. And had I only tested my father, I would only actually have half of his DNA to use for genealogy. Genome reconstruction made me aware of the portions that I was missing, and it gave me the motivation to go after them and to test people. So please, when you do your DNA, test everyone in the oldest living generation that you can. It is so worth it. Some of these people that I have tested have now been passed away. They've now been dead for almost 10 years, but I'm still using their DNA for my genealogy. I tested my grandmother. Um, not this, I tested one of my grandmothers in 2014, in August, and then she passed away in November. But I still use her DNA all the time. And it's a way for me to connect with her and to discover, gather, and connect our deceased ancestors. So definitely invest in it. And when you make a reconstruction, upload it to GEDmatch and Borland Genetics. It doesn't really matter how complete you get it. If you get a 75 or a 90 or an 80 or 100, it's still worth doing because it turns your heart, and it's really about the effort and how it changes you. And then all of the benefits that it gives you for your genealogy, that's just a bonus. Um, so again, with this summary, Lazarus, I really like this tool. It's really simple and it's easy to use. I would love this tool if there was a way to share the reconstructions with other people. Happy DNA and Borland Genetics, I both love. Happy is very simple, but it only works when you have the right relatives tested at one company. And so if you have one person who tested with 23andMe and the others all tested with MyHeritage, it is worth retesting that one relative just to make the tool work. Now, Borland Genetics, this works with any combination of relatives or tests. It can be overwhelming when you use Borland Genetics, just because there's so many tools on the website. So yesterday, I was actually at Home Depot trying to get tools to build a new roof for my shed with my dad. And every time I go to Home Depot, I get overwhelmed just because I think I'm going to get something really simple like shingles. And then it turns out there's a million different options, and I don't know the differences between them to know which one I need. Do I need the thicker shingles or the duration shingles? Do I need the black ones or the slightly bluish ones? And so Borland Genetics, I think, can feel that way if you're a new user. But the subscription tools are designed to help people like that. A lot of the tools are automated, like the visual phasing and the reverse phase. And also, you can book an online consultation with me, and I'm happy to help you through the process. But yeah, so genome reconstruction, I think, is just a wonderful way for us to discover, gather, and connect with our deceased ancestors. So we'll now turn the time over for questions if there are any.
That was a great presentation, Tanner. We do have some questions. So there's some questions related to each of the three products. So we'll just kind of go through them. The first one, John asked on Zoom, which place do you put the wife when you're using Lazarus?
In group 0.
Okay, the wife goes into group 0. Okay, then we had quite a few questions about Happy.
Uh-huh.
So if I have 3 siblings, 12 first cousins, and 3 second cousins, can I recreate a grandparent using Happy?
Happy only works with a person's living spouse and their children. So that's why. So if you have 3 children, I don't know if one of their parents is still alive, but if so, you can use Happy to reconstruct the other one. If not, what you've got is a lot of really good tools that can be used in Borland genetics, because it can use anything.
So it really sounds like Happy is easier to use, but has a more limitations because it's only doing the deceased parent.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I never go live on Borland Genetics because there's no way I can't accidentally show you a kit for a living person. Um, yeah, Happy. Yeah, you need the right combination of relatives. But if you do, it's pretty fast and it's really simple.
Awesome. So Bonnie on YouTube kind of asked a follow up with, so Happy creates a kit for the untested parent.
Exactly.
Okay, awesome. I think a lot of the other questions about Happy were pretty similar. Can you do a grandparent? It sounds like that's where you'd want to move to Borland. So, some questions about Borland. Would this work if you're trying to find parents of a paternal grandfather where he, his wife, and all 5 children passed, but all his grandchildren are living? Does that make sense? So, Tanner, are you still there?
Oh, I'm sorry. I clicked the little mute button on my microphone. I'm here.
Okay. So
Yeah.
there are a couple of questions where they're asking if you can do it, like like if the parents have passed away, can you do it at the grandparent level
Um,
on Borland?
yes, you can. I would recommend reconstructing one generation at a time. So I am working on reconstructing my great grandfather, and he's 2 generations back from any living person. But in order to do that, I've reconstructed Grandpa Farrell, and I've reconstructed his brother and his sister, and I'm using those to try and reconstruct the grandparent.
So you kind of have to reconstruct the deceased parent first and then use those to reconstruct the next generation.
I would, yeah.
Okay. So yeah, we had a couple questions. Then one of our users on YouTube asked, "Is Happy the same thing as GenMatch's phase kits for deceased parents?"
Okay, so the phased kits, yes and no. So basically, what a phased kit is on GEDmatch, that's also a subscription tool. You will compare your DNA to one or both of your parents. And then what it does is it separates your paternal and your maternal chromosomes from each other. So then you have 2 kits. One of them is all of your father's DNA that he passed on to you, and the other is all of your mother's DNA that she passed on to you. So Happy does the same thing with multiple siblings, but then it merges them all together, right? And so if I just do a phased kit on dad and grandma, I'm going to on GEDmatch, I'm going to end up with 50% of Grandpa Farrell's DNA. But if I do Happy and I compare grandma to 5 of Farrell's children, I'm going to end up with like 96% of his DNA as opposed to just half.
Okay. Um, John asks, "I have had some privacy concerns vis-a-vis law enforcement. Which of these 3 companies have the best privacy rules? I have relatives that decline, I'm guessing, for DNA testing for this reason."
Yeah, so GEDmatch, when you upload a kit, there is an option to opt in or out of law enforcement. Happy really doesn't apply to law enforcement at all because they don't have a database. And you're not truly uploading your DNA to Happy. It's actually running the script on your own computer. And so there's nothing for the police to even find there. Borderland Genetics, when you upload your DNA, it asks you, is this your DNA, someone who's given you permission? And then it says, are you law enforcement? And if you click that option, it actually says, we're sorry, this database is not for law enforcement.
That's good to know. So hopefully people are being honest.
Yeah.
Well,
But also, like with law enforcement, usually law enforcement, what they're doing is they're taking the sample of somebody that they don't know who it is, like a Jane Doe, and they're trying to figure out who that sample is. To really build a DNA kit, you need to know who all the kits you're uploading are for. And so I don't think law enforcement would really benefit from using it. Plus, there's only 15,000 kits in the database, so it's a really small database.
that makes sense. So these are probably tools that are just known and less used, but they're awesome. So
Yeah.
we're gonna go ahead and end here. I know there were a lot more questions, but we've already run over into Tanner's next class. We're gonna take just a brief break so that we can get the stream set up for all of the other social media channels that we're streaming to. So give us a minute and we'll get started with the last class for today, which is titled Why Oh Why Use Your Y DNA. That will be presented by Tanner. So
Thanks.
see you in just a minute.